goes there?
The Delaware Media Podcast.
Good evening, and welcome to the Delaware Media Podcast. Tonight's discussion centers on being a contemporary Lovecraftian and the work necessary to appreciate HPL in light of his difficult legacy of racism and other prejudices. I like to think about my journey toward becoming a Lovecraftian as a series of decisions I made, at each point taking the opportunity to go a bit deeper into this world that I eventually became ensconced in and comfortable with. And in doing so, I became more comfortable with myself, living in my own skin. Like a lot of people, the first time that I encountered Lovecraft, I actually wasn't aware that it was happening. For reasons we'll explore later on, his name often gets scrubbed from those early points of contact. And instead, you just kind of find something, whether it's a game, a film, or a toy, that hooks you, that pulls you with a bit of information, a mood often, or an emotion, or just a general feeling that causes you to want to go deeper. It gives you the opportunity to go deeper. And from those outer spheres, you travel inward. My first contact point with Lovecraft was the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game. Again, I hadn't really heard of the author or anything like that. I'd only heard of this game that provided a different experience, an experience of horror in gaming that was not paralleled elsewhere. And so taking a look, I found a dizzying world of history, of monsters, of magic, a setting that felt like home to me somehow, that felt comfortable to me. And I want to say the edition that I picked up first had a copy of the Call of Cthulhu in it. Most of the early editions did, and I believe that, the newer editions still do. That's kind of a trend in there. So Lovecraft is there, but he's in those first few pages, those pages that you tend to skip over when you're a seasoned role player and kind of want to get to the good stuff. So it wasn't actually it wasn't actually until I'd explored the book, explored the setting, that I noted this author, this person that seemed to be involved with all of the monsters and the ideas associated with the game. And then I put the game down for a little while and went about my life. But eventually the mood struck me and I came back to it. And I came back to it again and again, several times over a couple of years. And eventually I was taken with the notion of this author, and I wanted to explore a little bit of his work. And at the time, the Del Rey editions of his story collections were readily accessible at any brand name bookstore, and there were a few in my town. So I made my way over and collected a copy of, I want to say it was something like Blood-Curdling Tales of Horror and the Macabre. I remember the black sleek cover, and I remember the the kind of grayscale art with a bit of red on the cover as well. A bit of, not blood red, but kind of a dark, almost kind of cherry red. And I started looking through them, and I found, I started looking through the stories, and I found one of the first ones that grabbed my attention was Pickman's Model. And I mean, this was probably just out of high school, so I didn't have a lot of experience reading things like this. I had an aunt who constantly told me to read the classics, and I always kind of turned my nose up at the idea. And this was my first kind of foray into literature of this type. And so Pickman's Model was kind of a short story, so I dug into it a little bit and worked my way through it, and was profoundly impacted both by the material and by the reveal at the end. I thought was particularly noteworthy and definitely left me with a degree of emotion, something that I would return to later on. The other thing that kind of drew me in about the story were the creatures, the ghouls, and particularly the idea that they weren't just loathsome monsters that would rend and kill, but rather they almost had a humor to them. They had layers, they had depth, and it was something very different, and it struck me in a particular way. And then I set it down for a little while. But I came back to it again, this time in university. And this time I would say definitely it stuck. I was maybe in my sophomore or junior year and struggling a little bit to find meaning. And the tales of H.P. Lovecraft had a meaning in their meaninglessness. And that was something that really hit home with me. It really impacted me in a way that I would carry forward from then on, really. Always in the back of my mind, at least until I got a little older. But it was from there that I made the choice to go a little bit deeper. Now, the internet was fairly new at this time, and there wasn't a whole lot of information available on Lovecraft the man himself, not at least that a university student like me who wasn't paying particular attention to his studies could really get a hold of. But I learned a little bit about the man. I learned a little bit about his passion for the places that he lived and the places that he traveled that were nearby, and how he kind of lived this, well, seemingly from my perspective, this kind of ascetic life. And it struck me as strangely wholesome and enviable in its own way. I would carry this interest on until later discovering the fact that Lovecraft left a lot of correspondence behind, an obsessive amount of correspondence behind. I don't think it's an unreasonable statement to say that Lovecraft was obsessed with letter writing and with corresponding and with really sharing with the people around him kind of the diary of his life in a strange way. This very bizarre man left one of the more complete archaeological footprints available for his time, just through his letters, through his, what Clifford Geertz would call, thick description of the world around him. And granted, it was from his point of view, and that has to be taken into account, but it was remarkable to see the volume of information that was just available through his letters. And as I pawed through this archaeological trove, I was now maybe in my late 30s, early 40s. I was really starting to build kind of a picture of this man in my head. Really get a sense of who he was, of what his thoughts were, what occupied him, and what interested him. And I began to empathize with him. I began to be able to picture myself alongside him as another outsider, another person who was caught outside of time, feeling as though I was out of place, that society didn't really fit with me. And Lovecraft definitely showed that in his words and deeds. If you compare, for example, the Lovecraft letters and the writing that he did just among friends and family to the letters to the editor in the magazines where he published, like Weird Tales, it's a decidedly different language that he speaks. And he is very much outside the box in terms of his behavior, and definitely looking at the world from the outside in, not feeling as though he's a part of it. And that distance and that detachment, it kind of made sense to me. I mean, at the time, I would have been a young father, a graduate student who was struggling to cross the finish line with his PhD. And I can tell you just from my own personal experience that one of the most satisfying feelings that I experience day to day is the sense that I'm not alone. And so to have this kind of historical figure as a bulwark, as a tool with which I could make my way through a world that felt alien to me, that felt wrong for me, where I felt out of place, it was very comforting. I tend to joke that Lovecraft was my punk rock moment. And we'll kind of get back to that in a little while, because I was late coming to punk rock philosophy, but Lovecraft was what brought me to it. And his ideas and perspective gave me that drive to rebel amidst my alienation. And it really drove home some of the notions of punk philosophy. They weren't something that I understood from my background or from my friends or my social life, but I understood punk through Lovecraft. And Lovecraft changed my life. If I look back at kind of where I was when I started reading his work and where I ended up going, I came out in part because of Lovecraft. I made my first efforts to experiment with polyamory in part because of Lovecraft. I was radicalized and became the leftist that I am in part because of Lovecraft. And his ideas and legacy and the community that surrounds that began to kind of shape my life. It shaped the way I dressed. It shaped my ideas of recreation, his notions of long perambulations in deep thought and contemplation of his his environment led me to do some of the very necessary work to heal myself after COVID-19. Had me exploring the downtown of St. John's, Newfoundland with new eyes, the ability to appreciate architecture on an amateur level with the ideas of mood and emotion that were important to him. I mean, he shapes my home decor. I would say that, I sit in an office now that is surrounded by all sorts of Lovecraftian inspired art, be it actual kind of pieces from games or artists, all the way up to antiques that I've collected that kind of mirror his interests in the world. And he influenced my daily life in other ways. He influenced I named no less than 3 rats after him during the time that I kept a great deal of rats. And then I hit that point that every Lovecraftian does, that point of heartbreak. And I think it's safe to say that we all hit it. What we do with it is another matter. But we all hit that point of heartbreak when we discover his racism. Despite being prolific, it is very well concealed, mostly in the fact that it isn't discussed actively. And instead, we are left to have it pounce upon us in the dark, often in the midst of the joy of feeling complete, of feeling whole, of feeling like there's literature that we get and that gets us. And that heartbreak is part of what it is to be Lovecraftian. To be a Lovecraftian is to experience that deep, oh shit, dissatisfaction and remorse and guilt and shame. Truthfully, I think it's mostly shame that I think it really brings us when we look at the parts of his life that are kept away from the bookstore shelves, that you have to go hunting to find. And it's a source of personal misery to find to find the fly in the ointment like that. And so what do you do when you hit that point of, on the one hand, you're in this place of feeling like you've found something incredibly important, and then discovering it's tainted with these disgusting notions? Well, I'd say the first thing is you kind of go through the stages of grief. Denial and bargaining in particular. You say to yourself, it's something of its time. It didn't make up all of Lovecraft's life. It didn't impact his work as much as some people like to think. But these are all tactics that come before acceptance. And I've definitely seen my fair share of Lovecraftians that don't make it to acceptance. They veer off into these various kind of defense mechanisms. Because, again, they've found something that's vitally important to them figuring out how to make their way through the world. And so in the same way that I developed empathy and an idea of Lovecraft, I have empathy for Lovecraftians who struggle to face his racism. And part of the reason I'm recording this right now is because I want to help people who are in that place. because I've been there too. I've been at the top of the curve. I've been at the peak where, it all makes sense, and this is a great addition to my life that's going to help me live my life much more comfortably, and I can be myself. I can experience life in a way that fits with me because I identify as a Lovecraftian. And then the downslope hits. And the grotesque prejudice just mounts, because that's the thing. It isn't just of its time. It isn't just what everybody was doing in the moment. It isn't limited in any way. It is pervasive. It is aggressive. It is overwhelming. And it hits you typically right at a point in the kind of decision tree you've made to go deeper, where extricating yourself becomes very tricky. You've invested a lot of time and energy, and you're staring down the sunk cost fallacy. I think the first thing that it's vital to do is acknowledge that Lovecraft is not for everyone. As Lovecraftians, we absorb subcultural information that is on our frequency, but it may not be on other people's frequencies. To explain this a little better, I'll go back to an idea that I used to present to introductory folklore classes. When I used to talk about, what is folklore? How do you find folklore? And I used to say that if you see a piece of information that causes revulsion, that causes your gorge to rise, that causes disgust or discomfort, that's often a piece of cultural information that is not intended for you. It's kind of not on your radio frequency. And so as folklore students, I often taught people, go toward this. You have to unlearn the idea that you reject cultural information that doesn't belong to you. Because that's living culture as opposed to studying culture. And I think understanding that, twofold, it helps the fact that we need to acknowledge that Lovecraft is not for everyone, and we can't expect everyone to enjoy Lovecraft directly. I think evangelizing for Lovecraft is not the best strategy, and I think we should really recognize that most people's interactions with Lovecraft are going to be through those early stages where we started to make decisions as Lovecraftians to go deeper. So the games, the films, the toys, things like that. I mean, people can absolutely enjoy those without having to delve deeper. I think that decision is a very personal one. And it's one that I don't think Lovecraftians should really kind of try to influence in others. Especially now that more and more of the information about his racism is more widely available. I think it's important to acknowledge Lovecraft, the cultural figure, versus Lovecraft, the person. And distinguish that both for ourselves and in media that we produce. I'll be honest, and this is kind of my one hot take for this recording, is that some of the cringiest and most uncomfortable things that I've seen have been examples of attempting to take Lovecraft and sanitize him for the purposes of children's television, almost kind of making him sort of a Wednesday or Pugsley Addams type character in animation. I think that is I won't judge anybody for creating art that they want to create, but man, I would be careful about that. That I think opens up a difficult space and a difficult conversation that you might find yourself having on the back foot, which if you're going to have a difficult conversation, which I think you should, and I'm leading to that, I think that having that difficult conversation, you need to have it on the best terms possible. And so on the one hand, I mean, I have seen depictions of Lovecraft in media. There was a kind of a retelling, an ironic retelling of the Scooby-Doo story a few years ago. I think it was done by Cartoon Network. And I found the version of Lovecraft, kind of the Lovecraft pastiche in there, particularly funny, a little bit of an inside joke, and that was kind of humorous. But I think a full-blown sanitization of Lovecraft is not really achievable. I don't know if it ever will be. I really can't think of why you would do that unless you wanted to conceal aspects of Lovecraft that really shouldn't be concealed. I think another valuable thing to realize is that there's more to Lovecraft than just Lovecraft. Being a fan of H.P. Lovecraft, being a Lovecraftian, brings you into contact with a wide array of authors and works that extend far beyond Lovecraft. And I think that holding that idea is particularly important. We call ourselves H.P. Lovecraft fans, we call ourselves Lovecraftians, what have you, but there's actually a whole world there that we're summarizing with Lovecraft as a symbol, because that's kind of the best symbol that we have. It's often the gateway that leads us to this wider world, but the world of the old pulps, of weird fiction, and all of that, I think that recognizing that being a Lovecraftian means you are accessing a wider space than just Lovecraft himself. I think that is critical to moving past this discovery of difficult information. And finally, and I've left this for the end because I think it's the most important thing, and I think it is the thing that, I mean, if you do any of these things, this is the one that I want to encourage you to do. I want to encourage you to, if you're in the space of having discovered Lovecraft's racism and feeling that disgust and feeling that shame, I think one of the best things you can do is make an effort to cultivate a diversity in your reading and perspective. There are non-white Lovecraftians. First person that comes to mind always for me is Charles Saunders. I think looking at his Lovecraftian works as well as his sword and sorcery works or sword and soul works, that is particularly vital to understanding the depth and breadth of vision available within the Lovecraftian frame. I think looking at non-white authors writing at the time that Lovecraft was writing also provides critical counter-narrative. A primary example that I would give you would be Rudolph Fisher's The Conjure Man Dies. I think if you're struggling with what it means to be a Lovecraftian in light of Lovecraft's racism, I think the two things you can do for yourself right away: read the first book in the Amaro series by Charles Saunders, and then read The Conjure Man Dies by Rudolph Fisher. And I think those will start to give you perspective and start to start to help you do the work to break the cycle. And that's really what I want to talk about next, is breaking the cycle. What causes the cycle? What causes us to be in this place where, it's not immediately obvious to Lovecraftians, this kind of shameful secret of Lovecraft, and or even just fans of things like Call of Cthulhu. These are not immediately accessible ideas, and why aren't they immediately accessible? I think the reason that Lovecraft's racism is hidden by and large comes down to shame. And I want to talk about that. And I mean, by shame, I mean shame in a psychological context. A therapist once told me that the difference between guilt and shame is guilt is I have done wrong, I have been bad. Shame is I am wrong, I am bad. So immediately the difference there is you have kind of one point on a spectrum of behavior versus a defining principle. And I think the way that we often deal with Lovecraft's racism, consciously or unconsciously, and I'm definitely a big fan of unconscious thought influencing people, I'll say that right off the bat, was always big into the psychoanalytic method in social sciences and anthropology and folklore. And so I think what we do is we hide, we conceal Lovecraft's racism in shame. And because that shame weighs us down like an anchor, because it is part of us as opposed to a behavior that can be changed, we end up burying it. And then we get situations where the next generation discovers the shameful truth. And we have yet another group of young Lovecraftians kind of going, or Lovecraft fans, going through that up and down cycle where they discover something that is very meaningful to them, and then they discover this awful thing that's buried along with it. And so I would encourage valuing Lovecraft without acknowledging his racism, not as a shameful act, but as an act to feel guilty for. And again, guilt is in psychological guilt, meaning that you can change. Just because you previously didn't acknowledge Lovecraft's racism for whatever reason, doesn't mean that you can't wake up tomorrow and start acknowledging it and change the way you do things as a result of acknowledging it. I want to conclude with a pair of thoughts. These are perspectives that I try and hold simultaneously when it comes to being a Lovecraft fan or a Lovecraftian in 2025. Think of them as daily mental exercises that you can do in order to have that difficult and constant conversation that's important to have related to Lovecraft's racism and the fact that there are still reasons to appreciate and admire Lovecraft and be inspired by Lovecraft, both in your daily life and as a creator and appreciator of art. The first, I want to return to the notion of punk and punk philosophy. And I would say this is partially inspired by my own experience, but also inspired by Willem Pugmire and his perspectives. And if you want kind of a brief overview of Pugmire and his ideas, I would encourage you to have a look at the blog Deep Cuts in a Lovecraftian Vein, because there's some Pugmire information there that is particularly vital and also concentrated in a way that makes it very accessible. Pugmire was part of the Pacific Northwest punk scene, and was able to use Lovecraft as a tool to communicate punk thoughts and punk ideas. And Lovecraft and his writings kind of became a code word, according to Pugmire, amongst himself and his friends for expressing certain ideas, be they about kind of anti-capitalism, about nihilism, about non-heteronormative sexuality, or even just, flipping the bird at the system in general, and turning your back on the societal mechanisms that grind you down, embracing the grotesque. All of these things are important to punk, and you can find all of these things in Lovecraft. Lovecraft I sort of thought about this the other night, how Lovecraft really was, he left behind a perfectly formed punk squat. It was his legacy, his literary executorship and everything that went into that was all just, it was like an abandoned building, and anyone could just move in. And around the 1970s, the punks started moving in. And I don't know, I'd have to look deeper into this, and I want to look deeper into this, whether it was Lovecraft that influenced punk or it was punk that drew something out of Lovecraft. I have a feeling it was more the latter, because definitely when I found Lovecraft and when I started kind of looking at gaming forums and the like, and looking at the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, it was definitely seen as this outsider role-playing experience. It was not the usual fare, and it was kind of underground. It was an independent product of kind of this other world, this place where Dungeons and Dragons and more familiar kind of fantasy role-playing games didn't come from. And that punk aesthetic was present. Maybe not to the extent it might have been in Pugmire's case, but there certainly was something about it. And so I think somehow Lovecraft went through a transition, or Lovecraftianism went through a transition in the 70s, where it adopted the punk mantle, or had kind of the punk mantle thrust upon it. And so those of us who were growing up in the 80s and 90s, coming to it, it already kind of was suffused with that punk mentality. And I think that it's important to note that, the Lovecraftianism of today is not the Lovecraftianism of yesterday, and it's not the Lovecraftianism of decades before, or even the original kind of the original appreciation that rose up following HPL's death. It's transformed. It's changed. I say I'm a Lovecraftian, but that doesn't immediately. I mean, it creates a connection to the past. But the one thing about kind of tradition in the past, the idea that there are these connections to the past is really, it's a fabrication. At least looking at folklore scholarship, it's a fabrication. We fabricate a connection to the past as we continually reinvent our culture. But that's not necessarily the truth of the matter. And so I think, keeping in mind the Lovecraftian punk transformation that happened in the 70s and beyond, can help give us some perspective on the fact that contemporary Lovecraftianism or Lovecraft fandom is not the same thing as it was in the past. And so we can adopt different ethics, different morals as we move forward. The Lovecraftianism or Lovecraft fandom of tomorrow does not have to be as racist as it is today. And again, that returns us back to the idea that this is not shame, but guilt. This is behavior that can change. The second thought that I want to end on is something a little bit more personal. And I've told this story before. I've told this story to Perry Clark on his podcast. I've written it down. It was actually probably one of my first kind of Lovecraftian essays at delapormedia.com. It was, or rather it is that I really started to understand Lovecraft differently and my perspective on Lovecraft differently when I watched my father's casket being loaded into an above-ground crypt and having the door shut behind him. My relationship with my father, well, like a lot of people and their parents, was complicated. Kind of like my relationship with Lovecraft is complicated now. The older I grew, the less my father became the man that I remembered from childhood for a variety of reasons. And I began to, understand him in kind of a deeper and more cynical way, in a more adult way. And also, the other thing about being at my father's graveside is I was his inheritor. As soon as the funeral service was over, I had to turn to the other inheritors and say, okay, how do we deal with Dad's stuff? What do we do? And it was at this point where I was talking to my sister and my brother-in-law and some other people that it became clear to me that there were no rules. There were no sacred cows where my dad's belongings were concerned. They had to be dealt with. I mean, I lived in a completely different part of the continent, in another country from where my father lived. My sister lived in another part of the state and didn't really want to continually come back to what was home for my father and had been home in our childhoods. So we had to make some tough and immediate decisions about what to keep, what to throw away, and what to put up for sale. And again, it transformed my father's belongings, my father's estate, into something that was to be managed by myself and the other inheritors. My dad didn't have a say. He was dead. And he wasn't going to come back and complain about it. The only people that were responsible for dealing with this were myself and the others, my other fellow inheritors. So we had to make those decisions. We had to make those calls. And where I think Lovecraft fits into this is, again, if we return to that idea, I mean, Lovecraft is a particularly unique figure in literature in that without a clear inheritor, without a clear estate, a line of succession, a brand that moves on from one person to another, I mean, a holder of the intellectual property, there is no predetermined set of rules as far as what we do with Lovecraft's inheritance to us. And we are all Lovecraft's inheritors. That's the key. Everyone who acknowledges the existence of Lovecraft stands at his graveside, watches him be buried, and then has immediate access to the intellectual property that he left behind. And because of that, we can do anything we like with it. We can take Lovecraft in new and different directions. We might, as fans, as Lovecraftians, enjoy the things that he created. But we are not bound by them, nor are we bound by his wishes where they are concerned. I mean, one reason I really admired Lovecraft initially was because he was a stark materialist. I mean, no bones about it. He didn't believe in ghosts. So therefore, I don't expect his to show up and tell me that I am using his legacy improperly. And so I would suggest the same for anyone who wants to make use of Lovecraft's work, or who is discomforted, disconcerted by Lovecraft's work where his racism is concerned and wants to do something about that. And I mean, this is where we get into the kind of the contemporary counter-narratives, the Victor Lavals of this. I mean, Black Tom is a great example of taking Lovecraft's work and transmuting it into something else, transmuting it into a conversation with Lovecraft and presenting new ideas within an intellectual space that belonged to him, because it doesn't belong to him anymore. He's gone. It belongs to us now. And so I think with these two ideas, with the notion that Lovecraftianism changes over time, and Lovecraft's inheritance, or rather his inheritors, are all of us, and we may do with our inheritance as we wish. I think with those two ideas in place, we have the skeleton of a plan as far as what to do with Lovecraftianism in the contemporary era. I mean, as Lovecraft is, as some of his latter works are soon to reach their centennials, we are at a point where we can start to make the changes that we want in the genre, because the changes have already been happening. Thank you very much for your time. Take care, and have a good night. Thank you for listening to the Delapour Media Podcast. You can find a variety of horror gaming resources at www.delapour.media. That's Delapour spelled Delapore. Delapour Media, toward verisimilitude in tabletop role-playing. Take care. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Somebody Think of the Children, a suburban horror scenario where moms take on the Cthulhu mythos. Available for the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, and now available at a steep discount at Drive-Thru RPG. Check out the discount link in the show notes.